Invitation to talk about one of my very favorite buildings in the world and one of my very favorite designers. I have been privileged to be invited to give a number of these talks, the Vermont Humanities Council, and I love going to Vermont towns and the drive over here and what I learned. I had one eye on Route 7, I had the other eye sort of on the houses, and oh wow, the things I learned. Does anyone know about the cozy cottages? Those little hotels from the 1930s and 40s on Route 7, they're still there. That's pretty amazing. Pardon? Route 7, the cozy, they should, preservation, so. Well, how many of y'all have been to Monticello? Oh, well, I'm home. You know everything that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Okay, if there's one person who hasn't been, then I'll stay. But I think that Jefferson continues to be absolutely fascinating to Americans. And I think the fact that we have a room full of Yankees on a really cold night in March, after you all spent all day yesterday at town meeting, here tonight to hear about Mr. Jefferson is pretty amazing. I think that he would be extremely pleased that you're interested, and I think he would be very surprised that you would continue to be interested in him. Well, I want to talk about the Jefferson who especially interests me tonight. And when I came across this quote years ago, it really brought Jefferson. I just suddenly understood Thomas Jefferson. This was historian Gordon Wood, who taught at Brown University, and he wrote that we will never understand the young Jefferson, and this is absolutely true of the mature Jefferson as well, until we appreciate the intensity and the earnestness of his desire to become the most cosmopolitan, the most liberal. And by liberal in the 18th century, it meant broad-minded, to know what was the best in the world to know about, to be liberally educated, the most genteel and the most enlightened gentleman in all of America. What is so amazing is that Jefferson became this young man when he was living on the western frontier of Virginia. He was really living in isolation. And he is this self-creation where he decided at a very young age that he wanted to be exceptional. He did not want to do what every other planter's son in Virginia was doing. So as I talk about Jefferson tonight, remember that this is the man who early on decided that he was going to take a different course. He wasn't going to settle for what everyone else was doing, and he was going to rethink and investigate and redesign a lot of these buildings. So Jefferson's interest in what he wants to rethink and redesign and know the best of could be a legal philosophy, it could be a French wine, it could be a political theory, it could be what was the most fashionable art and architecture in France while he was visiting. He loved knowing these things. He wanted to know everything that was worth knowing. But here's the other part that makes me love Jefferson so much, and that is, it wasn't enough that he knew them. He wanted you to know them too. He wanted the people of America to know them. Jefferson was concerned about America and its very fragile conditions in the first decade after the Revolutionary War. And Jefferson is concerned that America needs models. America needs to become its own independent country, and it needs to legitimize itself in the eyes of the world. And for Jefferson, one of the ways that he thinks America can do this, we can legitimize, we can show what we're made of, we can show the rest of the world who expects this great experiment in Republican governance to fail, one of the ways we can show them who we are and what we are is through our architecture. Architecture, Jefferson believes, is a powerful mode of transforming people, transforming the nation, and transforming the world. So this is why he wants us to know what he knows. He doesn't learn this. He doesn't fashion himself to just keep it to himself, to be self-contained, but to help lead the nation. And Jefferson wants the American experiment to succeed, of course, but Jefferson really wanted Virginia. Wanted Virginia to be the most of all the states, the best of all the states. And so while his efforts in architecture and the arts and education were expressed for the nation, what Jefferson really wanted to do was to make Virginia the exceptional state in this brand new. So his efforts at architecture in Virginia were an effort to do just that, to make Virginia the model for the rest of the country, show the rest of the 12 states what Virginia could do, and perhaps the others would follow. Now, Jefferson is interested in architecture from a very young age, and this is probably because Jefferson's fashioning himself to become this cosmopolitan man who knows the best of everything in the world. And he had, from a very young age, requirements about how he wanted to live. So Jefferson never lived anywhere. Even when he was minister to France and living in the Hotel de Langeac in Paris, he remodeled, he remade it. No place he ever went to was the right place for Jefferson. And as we'll see at Monticello, he's tinkering for years to make it exactly what he wants it to be. So Jefferson, from a very young age, is interested in architecture, and he writes famously that architecture is my delight, and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements. And so Jefferson is essentially going to spend much of his life putting up and pulling down on Monticello Mountain. Now, Jefferson, I said, has this sense that he requires certain kinds of places, spaces, a certain kind of architecture in which to live, to become this exceptional man that he wants to be. But Jefferson, and this was true also of George Washington, Jefferson and Washington came from this Chesapeake culture. Now, if you know the Chesapeake, the history of the Chesapeake, you know that there are no towns or villages or institutions in that area almost into the 19th century. In New England, you have colleges, you have villages, you have town meetings, meeting houses, places where people come together regularly. But in the South, you don't have those places, especially where the elites like Jefferson can come and meet up and sort of perform their status. So in the South, the plantation becomes everything. The plantation is the place where, of course, you live your private life, but when somebody wants to do business with you, when somebody needs to get a job for their son, when somebody needs to borrow corn to make it through the winter, they come to your plantation. Your plantation is like a billboard. It says who you are. George Washington understood that he was the most admired man in America after the Revolutionary War. Also the most powerful, or at least potentially powerful, if he chose to use that power. But Washington, after he retired his commission from the Continental Army, retreats back to Mount Vernon. And he's going to spend the next 10 plus years finishing Mount Vernon, turning it into a place that was fit for a man of his stature. So Chesapeake planters are not just creating home places, but they are creating these landscapes, these social landscapes where others come and do business with them and take their measure. This is where you perform your status. So Jefferson and Washington understood that one's character, who you are, who you want people to know, what you want people to know about you, is powerfully proclaimed by your house. And I am reminded of this when I ask my students, have anybody been to John Adams' house? Quincy, yeah? John Adams in Quincy? John Adams thought he lived in a pretty nice house. But it's nothing like this. And this is that cultural difference. This is that Chesapeake planter creating this place that is a marker of their status and their place in that society. John Adams wasn't part of a society like that, didn't need it. And in fact, he would playfully, I think he called, what did he call his place, Monticello or something? When he and Jefferson were writing, he would make fun of his tiny little house, that by comparison to Jefferson's house. So, and of course, what Jefferson is doing up in Monticello, we know now that Jefferson had two families. Jefferson designed Monticello for two families. His white children and their children, and also the African-American family that he had. And Jefferson uses architecture, Monticello, its design and redesign, to organize the lives of both of these families, those who had access to him and those who did not. In the late 18th, early 19th century, nobody in America was as informed about architecture as Thomas Jefferson. He had collected books, he had read. Architecture, as I said, was so important to him, so important in becoming the man that he wanted to be. And so Jefferson becomes well known among his colleagues and among his neighbors for designing buildings. And this is one of the wonderful little sort of these villas that he designed for his friends in and around Charlottesville. And he's not a great architect. These aren't great buildings. But Jefferson loved architecture, and he had a library of architectural books. And he said that he couldn't design without his architectural books. So when he sold off his library to become the Library of Congress, one of his friends writes him and says, "I'm building a new house. Can you help me design it?" And he said, "No, I just sold my books, so I can't do anything." And he immediately begins rebuilding his library, rebuilding a second library, because he could not live without his books. So what I want you to understand about Jefferson and architecture is that he designs quite a few buildings in America, around Charlottesville. But he did so because he believed, and he was our first and last president who did so. Jefferson believed that architecture was important. Architecture matters in the lives of Americans. It improves us, it improves the quality of our lives, it improves our institutions. And so, as part of his desire to teach us about architecture, Jefferson uses the books in his library to design some extraordinary buildings, like the Virginia Capitol in Richmond. Jefferson loved this temple. Jefferson was in Paris as minister to France, and he went to Nîmes, and this was the best preserved French Roman temple in France. And Jefferson wrote back to a friend saying he stared for hours at this building like a lover at his mistress. He loves architecture. Okay. And Jefferson, again, Here's Virginia. Virginia's building, they've just moved their capital to Richmond out of that old, terrible town of Jamestown. He wants Richmond to do something extraordinary. So he sends a design for the new state capitol based on a Roman temple. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. Nothing had been designed like this in America. And he really hoped that this would become the model for all of these new state capitals that are going up in the 1780s and early 1790s. So Jefferson is especially fond of Roman buildings, Roman architecture, architecture of the Roman Republic. And so Jefferson, all through his life, through his books, through his travels, through his writing, through the buildings that he built, he engages in a lifelong effort to improve the architectural character of America. He's got a day job, he's really busy, but he thinks architecture is so important that when he's called to provide a design, he wants to, because he realizes it's incumbent on people like him who know something about architecture to teach others. He had such faith in America and in Americans. He really believed that if only we saw good examples of architecture, he looked around, he could see nothing to admire in America. And he wanted to provide us with our first great models, many of them modeled in some way on Roman architecture, because he knew America is going to be judged to a significant extent by its architecture. He knew that the world was watching. What kind of cities are Americans going to build? What kind of houses? What kind of public buildings hold this new fragile government? So Jefferson was determined to be there teaching us. So Jefferson is a mentor to America, an architectural mentor. And this begins quite early on, and he never ceased to believe that if we had buildings, good models of architecture, that we would be so moved we would want to follow. Well, this evening I want to talk specifically about this building. I showed this a couple of weeks ago in my class, and when I put it on, I didn't know what slide was going to come up, and my students just burst out laughing. I said, okay, Monticello, and then this came up on the screen. And it made a lot of them feel good about their drawing skills. That you can do amazing things and not be a fabulous architect. Jefferson, I think, had three intertwined goals in mind up at Monticello. If we want to understand what he was doing, we want to understand why he undertook a lifelong project to build his house, putting up and pulling down, and putting himself deeply, deeply into debt. First of all, the first explanation, I think, is that this is deeply personal to Jefferson. The house was made to be that perfect asylum for Jefferson. Jefferson was intensely private. He did not like public life, and at every opportunity he would run back to Monticello, sort of escape to Monticello. So whatever this house was going to be, it was going to be the perfect expression of what Jefferson wanted. It was a house designed just for him. Nobody else could live in this house, because it was designed for Jefferson and his public and private lives. Second thing is that Jefferson intended this building to be a highly visible statement of who he was. He begins building Monticello as a young man. So from the get-go, he wants to make a statement about this up-and-coming young Virginian. And one of the ways he's going to do that was with his house. He was a highly ambitious young man, and architecture factored into his ambitions and his desire to express himself as a member of the Virginia power elite. And then thirdly, Monticello was really meant to be an architectural model that would inspire Americans. because, as I said, Jefferson looked around and he saw American buildings were uniformly undistinguished. And he, as I've tried to express, he took it upon himself to counter that, to be a mentor to us. So Jefferson begins planning for this house in 1767. He has just graduated from the College of William and Mary. He's a lawyer. And he has also just inherited about 5,000 acres from his father. His father's died. His father was a very wealthy planter. And so Jefferson returns to Charlottesville to establish himself as a lawyer, to enter politics. And of course, anyone with ambitions of this sort needs that powerhouse, essentially that plantation, from which to operate. Jefferson picks a building site. He's got 5,000 acres, but he picks a building site on top of a mountain. Now, this isn't a surprise because since the beginning of building, we have put our most important buildings on mountains. You know, temples to the gods, shrines. We want our house to be there with a view that everyone could see up to us, but we look down to them. So Jefferson put his house on a mountaintop. But this is 1767. And this made it doubly, triply hard to get building materials up there. There are no roads, no water, no nothing. This was the most difficult site he could have chosen. But it tells us a lot about Jefferson and his desire to get that house he wants and what he is willing to do and the money he's willing to spend and the difficulty he's willing to put his family through in order to have this kind of house. So Jefferson picks a mountain and begins to build the house. And we're expecting him to do something exceptional. Remember, this is the man who said he wanted to be the most cosmopolitan, the most educated, the most liberal. So he's not going to build a plantation house that looks like those Georgian plantation houses like his friends grew up in, that Jefferson grew up in. Jefferson's going to do something different. He wants to show us who he is. So Jefferson goes to Andrea Palladio. Palladio, the great Italian Renaissance architect who had designed beautiful, beautiful villas. Now, Jefferson never went to Italy. He never saw any of the Palladian villas as much as he loved them. What he did, however, is that he had books. Andrea Palladio published 4 books, meaning the 4 chapters of architecture, and in book 2, he published designs for all of his country houses. So this is the building Jefferson has in front of him as he is designing that first Monticello. Jefferson is going to have an Italian Renaissance villa on his mountaintop. Right. But Jefferson is not a Venetian noble. He is not a rich Vicentine noble either. So he simplifies it. And in the 18th century, in both England and in Europe, there is a kind of fad for Palladio. Palladio is the rage. If you've been to England, the great English country houses, those long multi-part buildings, those were often designed according to plates in Palladio's book, or similar plates, others published, developed out of Palladio. So Jefferson is operating in this larger intellectual world. So he takes his design. You can see him sitting at the table with his straight edge and his pen and that image right in front of him. And he simplified just enough so that the original, the essence of the original is still in place. And I hardly need to say that nothing like this existed in America. And this is exactly what Jefferson wanted. It would show him to be an exceptional man, but it would also be a model to others of what was possible. Jefferson referred to Palladio's 4 books as his architectural Bible. He owned multiple copies. He gave copies to his friends, to his workmen, and he took his designs out of these books. The larger point I want to make is Jefferson's not a great architect. Okay? He has his books, he's traveled, he knows more than anyone else, but he is still an amateur. But the fact that he was doing designs of this sort drawn from Renaissance villas as a young man living in the back of beyond in Virginia shows the extent to which Jefferson was trying to become this most cosmopolitan, this best read, most wise man. So this is the first Monticello, and the design was unique in that no other building in America had been based on Palladio's 4 books of architecture. And again, if you think about the facade of this house, the exterior of this house is a billboard. This is the public face Jefferson wanted to present as a young 24, 25-year-old man just beginning his career. 24, 25, an Italian Renaissance villa on a mountaintop. You know, this is a pretty audacious way to begin. So the floor plan to this, the house is also very interesting as well. Whoops. I think I got behind. Let's see. Even though the exterior of the house was drawn from the Italian Renaissance villa, Jefferson still was a slave-owning plantation, planter. So he had to live in this house much as he did, much as the other planters did. He needed a dining room, he needed a parlor, he needed a fancy chamber. And so the original Monticello had these same 3 main rooms you would have found throughout the other planters' houses. Only his was encased within this Italian Renaissance facade. But then Jefferson, again, where did he get this idea? In Virginia, in the slave culture, the planters have expelled the slaves from the house. And the slaves work in smokehouses and kitchens and cribs and barns and dairies and workshops and independent buildings spread around the plantation. Jefferson gathers his outbuildings into this U-shaped structure on which he is going to build the house. Now, in the image I showed of New England, in New England we have outbuildings as well. But because of the weather, the climate, and different building traditions, instead of separate houses, in the 18th and 19th century, farmers would build a little house. Sometimes they would add a new big house in front. Then there would be a back house and a barn. These were the service areas, and they were connected. This worked for New England. This worked for the way New Englanders lived, for the climate, for livelihood and agriculture. But in the Chesapeake region, this is what most plantations look like. This was a very famous painting of it's an ideal Chesapeake plantation. And what it shows is the main house. And then as we come close to the river, and of course the rivers are the roads. The rivers are the way you get your tobacco to out to sea and over to England, and it's the way in which you import goods. So from that big house down to the river were all of the outbuildings, and these were the slave quarters. And those who came to Virginia, or to the South really, for the first time, were amazed. There's no cities, there's no towns, but they said if you go down the river, every few miles, there's what looks to be a little village, a little collection. So these are operating independently, and everyone lives like this. Well, not Jefferson. Again, Jefferson is going to do something quite different. So this, if you remember your visit to Monticello, it's always so hard to explain, or for me to explain. This area is brown. And this is the area that the house sits on. And all of the rooms here are service rooms. There's a rum room and a wine room and storage rooms. And over here we have kitchen and smokehouse, and we have slave quarters. And over here we have carriage houses and stables for Jefferson's horses and chariots. So this area is out of sight. It's underground, and the house sits on it. And these two wings that come out in a U shape in back of the house the land has been graded so that you don't see those outbuildings. When you step out of the house, oh, well, here's the basement. So here we are. And the only people who come down here are the slaves. These are very raw working areas. Okay, so we're here looking down that long corridor that will emerge at the other end. And here are those wings that are bermed in, or the earth is graded, so that when you're standing in the back of the house, in the garden of Monticello, you look over and what you see are terraces. And the workspaces are out of sight. Out of sight, out of mind in many ways. Jefferson hides the smells, the noise, his discomfort with slavery, and he puts all of that beneath the ground so that when we're walking on his terrace and looking back to the house, this is what we see. But below us, on either side, are the working areas of the house. But again, out of sight. Nothing that he has to deal with day to day. Jefferson begins working on the house. This is a model of what the house probably looked like in 1679. So after a couple of years of clearing the ground and preparation, he begins to design the buildings. And a few years later, Jefferson marries. And at the time he marries, the only part of the house that's finished is this sort of outbuilding that's one day going to be connected to the terrace and then connected to the house. But Jefferson brings his new bride to his plantation, and they live in that building for quite a long time. The house that you visit when you go up to Monticello is a house that Jefferson never knew. Jefferson worked on this house from 1767 till the day he died. It was never finished, and it was always in the process of becoming something else. So what happens is that Jefferson's wife dies 1782, and by all accounts, he was deeply in love with his wife, and he is devastated by her death. Jefferson's friends, he disappears for 6 months. He won't come out of his room, essentially, at Monticello. So his friends arrange for him to be sent to France as minister to France. And as Jefferson's, one of his biographers said, in France, Jefferson became the man he wanted to be. France, the salons, the art galleries, the music, the theater, the art, the architecture, the fashion, the flirtatious women and the smart women and the Enlightenment thinkers. These were all that Jefferson wanted. So Jefferson is in France 1784, 1789. And when he returns to Monticello in 1789, the house, which was unfinished when he left and had been left in the hands of an overseer, is in ruin. Nobody's lived there. Nobody's really taken care of it. It is in ruin. There's nothing he can do because Washington has summoned him to become his Secretary of State. So Jefferson goes off to New York, then Philadelphia, to become Secretary of State. Then Jefferson and Hamilton clash, and frequently, yes. Jefferson thinks, it sounds childish, I think it was, that Washington liked Hamilton best. And so he resigned his position as Secretary of State, and he comes back to Monticello in 1793. So he's been gone now for almost 10 years from this unfinished house. And it is really a mess. When he came back to Monticello in 1794, he said, this was it. This was the end of his public life. And he was going to begin to dedicate himself to the rebuilding his house and to becoming a country gentleman and living among his flocks and his people, his children, and hopefully his grandchildren. Well, Jefferson comes back from France a very different man. He's been to France. He's traveled through France. He's traveled to England. He has seen the most fashionable buildings in Paris and London. And that first Monticello that he had designed out of a book looks so clumsy, so amateurish. This 30 years later, it looked pretty good. But now he knew what beautiful, important architecture is. So after he's resigned as Secretary of State, he returns to Monticello. 1794, he begins the rebuilding in earnest. But a few years later, 6 years later, he's called back to a day job, being President of the United States. And so he is and so he can't do anything on Monticello. So when he retires from the presidency, 1809, and comes back, that's when a lot of the work gets done. Finally, he's at home. But Jefferson, the man who returned from Paris, had a new building model in mind. What he had really admired in France were these brand new fashionable hotels. And these hotels were French urban houses. They were private houses. And they were simple and compressed, but they were classical, and they were done in the most recent, most fashionable architectural style, the neoclassical. And the neoclassical was the favorite architectural style of all the French Enlightenment thinkers. So Jefferson wants to know what's good and what's important, comes back to Monticello, and he wants a French hotel. Not only that, he had seen a dome on a hotel. This still stands, the Hotel du Somme. If you know Paris, the Musée d'Orsay is just a few blocks in back of this. This building sits on the Seine. And Jefferson, again, always looking for the unusual, always looking for the exception, sees that somebody has built a dome on their house. Now, domes through history have always been associated with institutional buildings, churches or baths or temples, the Pantheon, whatever, but never with a house. But Jefferson decides he wants one too. Okay? So he comes back from France with all of these ideas. What he essentially does, here's the original Monticello in white. Bedroom, parlor, dining room. Jefferson essentially pulls off the facade, that Italian Renaissance villa facade, and then he rebuilds this house around that original core, what remains. What I want you to notice in this image on the bottom is that when you see Monticello, when you see it today, you just see the house. You come up to the hill, and you're brought up by this beautiful processional landscape, but it looks like the house is there all alone at the top of the hill. Nobody else. nothing else in view. That's exactly what Jefferson wanted. As I said, Jefferson was an intensely private man. So he essentially divides the house, divides Monticello, the rebuilt Monticello, into a private section and a public section. And Jefferson essentially lived only on the first floor. He rarely went upstairs. Upstairs is the domain of slaves and servants and grandchildren and storage, and he had no idea usually what was going on up there. So this is Jefferson's Monticello, and then this is the public domain. Jefferson, like George Washington, knew that people were going to come up to Monticello, just as they appeared all the time at Mount Vernon. And Jefferson's daughter recounts at night, you know, they were sitting in the dining room having dinner, and they look up, and there are these people sort of looking in the windows trying. So Jefferson builds a house that is going to be a model to everybody who comes up to see it. They will be impressed. They've never seen anything like this. And then they're going to go back to wherever, and they're going to want to build something similar or want to see buildings like this built. So Jefferson builds this Monticello to teach us, but also to tell us who he has become. Thousands of people come up to Monticello, and Jefferson was prepared for them. I want to give you a tour of the house, take you around the public circuit. First room you go into is the entrance hall. And Jefferson called it his Indian Hall. This was a room which, by the time Jefferson died, there were over 1,000 objects in the room. Many of them had been brought back by Lewis and Clark on the expedition that Jefferson had organized. So you would come into this room, the slave, the valet would let you into the room. This is as far as most of us are going to get. But for everybody who made the trip up to Monticello, they had their first glimpse of essentially a museum. And this was less a museum of the sort we're familiar with than a cabinet of curiosities, paintings, sculptures, maps, fossils. So it was in this room, and you were invited to stay as long as you wished, and there were 26 chairs put in around the room, so you could look and study and wonder at these things as long as you wished. And for thousands and thousands of Americans, this was their first education, maybe in geography, in Native Americans, in the arts, and even the mezzanine up. Jefferson arranged on the second floor to have this mezzanine that you could go from one side to the other, not needing to come downstairs, and you could sort of overlook the room and see what was going on. But this was a room, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But for thousands of Americans who had never seen a map, who maybe didn't know what America looked like, who didn't know what Virginia looked like, this was an opportunity for them to learn. But importantly, they also understood they were in the home of an extraordinary man. Now, if we were a friend of Jefferson's, we have another view taken from the mezzanine. So imagine 1,000 objects in this room. Wow, an Indian Hall. If we were an intimate, we would be invited to go into the parlor. And you can tell the room is 2 stories tall. It has this beautiful molding around it. Jefferson's shipped back 87 crates of furniture from France. And a lot of the paintings and the furniture that are in this room are part of what he sent back. And you have the sense again of him trying to recreate this period of time in which he was the man he wanted to be. And he's trying to recreate some of that. But we're brought in here, we discuss the paintings, perhaps Jefferson's daughters play the piano, there's music, there's conversation, and then we're led in, here's the door from the parlor into the dining room. Dining was the social event in a plantation. It was said in the 18th century, eating became dining. Eating became dining. In the early 18th century, you just sort of handed around a bowl or you shared. But as the elites wanted to begin to live differently, they turned dining into something that had courses and multiple kinds of food and chocolate cups and teacups and coffee cups and wine glasses and water goblets and special forks for fish and special forks for just eating becomes dining because it's theater. And you bring your guests into your two-story dining room with a skylight and beautiful lights or windows that open on to the back. Now, many of you know that this is the room where they tell you Jefferson loved wine. Apparently, he ran up a huge wine bill when he was president, living in the White House. Just shot through his salary. But directly beneath the dining room is the wine room. Now, I've tried to give you the sense that Jefferson lives uncomfortably with his slaves. Jefferson, through his life, he's growing, he understands slavery's wrong, but he can't get rid of his slaves. He is so in debt. He needs them to continue to work for him, to produce money, to be able to buy and sell slaves. He needs slaves. Jefferson in the dining room said he didn't like to have the slaves in the dining room because slaves overheard the conversation at the dinner table, and his dinner companions might be James Madison. And then the slaves left the room and they went back and they told somebody they knew that Mr. Madison said this and this is what's going to, and then it's spread to the next plantation, and then it's garbled. So Jefferson tried to devise ways to keep the elegance of the dining room, but without the need for slaves. So he designed two dumbwaiters, one on either side of this beautiful fireplace, and when more wine was needed, the dumbwaiter was lowered into that wine room. The slave down there who's on station puts the wine in and sends it up. Dinner continues. The other thing, behind this arch, again, out of sight, the food is being brought up from the kitchen, and the kitchen is really on the other side of the house, on the other side of that underground tunnel. Just out of sight of his guests, Jefferson designs a revolving door. On the other side of this door, it's just a flat door, looks like a plain door, but once it's turned, slaves on the other side who brought food from the kitchen put the meals on these shelves, and then the door is turned. One slave then can serve everyone at the table. So these are often sort of touted as, wasn't Jefferson clever? Wasn't he an inventor? Well, certainly he was. But this is a house that he is designing for himself, the way that he lives. This is a guest room. It's usually called the Madison Room because when James Madison would come from Montpelier, his plantation not too far away, this is where he would stay. But he's on the other side of the house from Jefferson. Okay. Now, Jeffersons Quarters. Jefferson, to give you an idea of what he's doing, he calls his quarters his sanctum sanctorum. And people who come to visit him, even people who are invited to stay, are often very disappointed. He doesn't come out very much. They saw him at breakfast, but then he disappears into his books, into his letters, into his daily correspondence. And so what we know now is that this entire side of the house was Jefferson's. And he had his library dispersed through these 3 rooms and into his cabinet. So we are standing where the red mark, looking toward Jefferson's cabinet or his study, and you see the kinds of shelves he has built for his books. When Jefferson goes away, these bookcases come apart, and you can nail a flat piece over them, so he can take entire bookcases with him when he travels. Books are important. Books are important. So we're looking down to his cabinet. This is the place he spends hours reading. And we see on his desk the machine that he loved, that as he wrote thousands and thousands of letters. And he made a copy. He bought a polygraph machine. It was 2 pens, and as he would write the letter, the other pen would make a copy of it. So we have copies of everything Jefferson, every list he made, practically, my husband says, who's not very fond of Jefferson. I bet you have his laundry list too, huh? But for Jefferson, it was more almost political, because letters get lost. Letters are sort of stolen out of the mail. People make up stories. And so he could produce the original if something of that sort had happened. But he would spend his days here with his books, his scientific instruments, and becoming this incredibly interesting but solitary man. This is his bedroom. And again, a 2-story bedroom. Okay. So here's his study. Jefferson designed it with these beds he had seen in Paris so that he could get out of bed on either side. If he was ready to go to work, he would just get up and hop into the chair. On this side, this was his dressing area. You see a kind of opening. This is a door with stairs that go up, and these are openings that ventilate this area. This was his closet. And so Jefferson's valet would climb the stairs, select Jefferson's clothing, put it in a dumbwaiter, and it is delivered to the other side of the bed, a closet on the other side of the bed. When you go to a lot of southern plantations, one of the things that you notice are the stairs, these huge sort of Gone with the Wind stairs that you can make dramatic entries. These are the stairs at Monticello. And this is the reason you can't go upstairs except if you pay a lot of money to do so, because of fire codes. But Jefferson never used those stairs. These were the stairs of the slaves. They were in the corridor, again, behind doors, out of sight, out of mind. Now that also we know about his relationship with Sally Hemings, stairs of this sort where you can come and go and not be seen or draw the attention of anybody else in the house also make a great deal of sense. And circulation as well. This is Jefferson's side of the house. He had a greenhouse here, and he could leave his quarters all by himself, not interfering with anyone else in the house, come out to the terrace and go out to the garden. And again, so when I say he designed it for himself, this private man who craved calm, who hated conflict, it was a place where he could retreat as often as he could. Now here's the room beneath the dome. Monticello is so interesting. It is 4 stories, 5 stories. You've got a basement level here. You've got the first floor. You've got the second floor. You've got a 3rd floor, and then you have a dome room up on another level. Nobody has figured out what this room was for. No one knows how it was used. And again, Jefferson just wanted it, but he wanted a dome room. For whatever reason, because that's what the French had, I'm not sure. But he wanted to have one too. So this is Monticello. This is the building that he's been working on since 1769. the story doesn't end well for Jefferson. In spite of decades of effort and expense and putting up and pulling down, he writes this famous letter where he says to his correspondent, I have to stop writing now because we don't have any glass in the windows and the ink is freezing in my inkwell, so I can't write anymore. Jefferson is willing to live in that level of discomfort and make others around him live like that to get what he wants. He spent all of this time. Right before he dies, 1826, Jefferson is essentially in debt the equivalent of $2 to $3 million. And Jefferson tries to think of a way to save the house and the property for his one remaining daughter, so she'll have something. So Jefferson comes up with this idea of a lottery. Lottery are legal, so he needed the approval of the state legislature in order to do this. Finally, it's approved, but essentially nobody wants to buy a lottery that takes Jefferson's land from him. By this time, he's in his 80s, 83, 84, and it was just distasteful, almost. But Jefferson dies, and 2 years after his death, his daughter is forced to sell the house, and she is forced to auction off all but a few family heirlooms. And that's why there's Monticello, I say there at one time there was all of these things in this room because they were dispersed, they were sold. And so ultimately the story of Monticello is that Jefferson was unable to preserve what he had so carefully constructed over the decades. Gone. This is what Monticello looked like in the mid-19th century. So thank you very much. Yes, please. Yes, ma'am. Okay, sure. There was a story that Monticello, after Jefferson died, was used to store hay. It was bought by somebody at auction, but they couldn't keep it up, and so it passed through hands, and that's when it began to fall. So I don't know specifically, but just given the general condition of what the house fell into, and it's not unlike other stories you hear of these plantations, especially in the 19th century during the war. Nobody can keep them up, nobody can keep them going. They fall apart, and they're used for storing animals or hay, crops in the attic. So, yes, sir.
When was that picture taken?
This picture was probably taken in the 60s, 1860s.
So when was Monticello
Turned into a native?
into the public monument that we see today?
In the late 19th century, there is, after the Civil War, America gets nostalgic for the colonial era and the founders. Americans think we have almost lost, we almost ruined what the founders had created. Let's go back and capture some of that time and that character. And so that's when we began in the late 19th and early 20th century to try and find what remained in Deerfield, in Williamsburg, at Monticello, and at Mount Vernon. So I don't know the exact dates, but I think it would be in the late 19th century. And I think it was School Children of America who gave their pennies or something. I mean, it was, it's like the nation got behind this to restore Jefferson's house. But Mount Vernon looked a lot like this as well. So.
Whose money was it? Federal money or state money?
A lot of private money. I know at Washington's it's private. It's the ladies of Mount Vernon. There were groups of women, well-to-do women from every state who were named regents, I think, and were appointed. They fundraised and they oversaw the house, and they still do to a large extent today. So I suspect at some point federal money got involved, but not till the 70s, 1970s or so. Yeah, I think it was that late. Yes, ma'am. That was on the first level.
Oh, on the first.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, that wasn't clear. Yes, he just lived in his spacious study and his bedroom. And
He actually did live in this house. He lived in the completed house.
This was a photograph taken in 1860s. So he lived in this in Monticello to 1826 when he died. On the same day John Adams died, everyone thought, oh, there is a God, you know. But the house that Jefferson knew was never finished. When we go to Monticello, everything is beautiful. Jefferson never saw it with all the windows with glass in them and everything finished and everything polished. There was always something happening at if you own a home, you know, it's always something. You own a home like this in the early 19th century, it is, you know, it just major headaches. So what I meant was he never knew it in a polished final state. It looked a lot like this, but it wasn't. He's still working on it. You know, he'd be down at Home Depot, you know, on Sunday morning. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of things. As I understand it, we were there in November.
Great.
My memory's a little bit better, but it's a private foundation.
The Monticello Foundation.
I think almost made a point of saying there's no federal money involved at all, which is why it's not a state park, and
Right.
why, you know, they have the rules that they have. The second thing, they mentioned there was a Jewish family who kept that
Levy.
place going for
Right.
many years, and I'm not sure how much money they put into it. But
I think Commodore Levy and from Charlottesville was greatly admired Jefferson, and I think that he acquired the house sometime around this time because he was appalled by what had happened to it. But he did not have the funds either. I mean, a handyman's cottage, you know, and fixer-upper, you know, a little imagination, you know, some sweat equity. He tried to keep it together, but Mr. Levy is credited with sort of keeping the house together and keeping it from just falling into ruin. And I think that it was purchased from him or his estate then. Yes, so thank you. Yes, sir.
Jefferson's finances, I'm hearing a guy who spent 5 years in France, 10 years in public service, built this extraordinarily, what had to be expensive house. I mean, how are those two things jive?
Yeah. Okay, this is such an interesting thing. Historians say Jefferson, and this is true also of Madison to some extent, were willfully ignorant of finances. That this is part of the great dispute with Hamilton. Hamilton knew how to get the country out of debt and how to get it up and running, but it involved banks and credit and stocks and all of these things that to Southern planters sort of sounded like voodoo. They had been Southern planters had lived for centuries in debt to their factors in England. And so living in debt was something that they understood quite well. But this idea of banks and stock exchanges and things of that sort, they didn't trust them. And they would not, they willfully would not trust them. So Jefferson thought if we just, you know, everyone goes along their own way. We're a country of farmers. We trade with each other. We don't need banks and things like that. So Jefferson was not cognizant. He kept records of when his peas bloomed every year, but he did not keep financial records. You know, again, because this is something you are accustomed to. But what happened to Jefferson is that he always spent way more than he earned. And of course, you always hope that the next year the tobacco crop, the grain crop is going to be greater. You'll get more money. It never happens. You're always in debt. And then in the late teens, early 1820s, Jefferson co-signed a note for a friend of his, Wilson Carey Nicholas. And Nicholas defaulted on that loan. And that left Jefferson in debt for it. And so that just compounded an already bad. And so he's living on credit. He's the glass for Monticello coming from Europe, a lot of the furnishings and the fixtures coming from Philadelphia. Because he is Thomas Jefferson, they are willing to extend credit to him, but it sort of caught up with him in 1826. Does that give you a sense of, yeah? It's boggling. You know, my students have this say, like wrapping their heads around this, and I always say that we have to just accept Jefferson in all of his humanity, that people do stupid things, or they, you know, really smart, or we can't explain. And Jefferson, in all of his humanity, chose to build this. It was so important on so many levels. This was his home place. This is all he had. His wife has died. All but two of his children died. Then, you know, one of those two children died. This is what he has.
Could we add one thing?
Oh, of course, yes.
I would like to say that in Paris, on the Seine, is now a huge, magnificent sculpture of Jefferson. That the French people adore Jefferson. And they love so many Americans, so many heroes. But here was one who had a passion for beauty, for aesthetics, for the perfect line, for the perfect wine. Apparently, he spent $4,000, which was an enormous amount of money, on wine to bring back to America for his famous cellars. The bronze enormous sculpture is right on the Seine, near the Trocadero, near the place where Princess Diana was killed in that horrible accident. And it is sumptuous. It has the ponytail of Jefferson. It has his wonderful hat, and it has feet. That big. So what I would like to say, and thank you for this magnificent talk tonight, is that this man was balanced with his folly, because it's a folly, it's a passion, it's a folly. He knew perfectly well what he was doing, and he left a monument. As a French-American woman, I am so proud of Jefferson to have found something, and the food and even the love for women, he needed two. Which is very French. So I think that tonight we've been spoiled. We had something which could not be. I mean, these dumb waiters, can you imagine the secrecy, the everything, how much you need to think about all these details. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. When President Hollande visited last year, President Obama took him to Monticello. Yes, sir.
Last question. What was the connection and history of Poplar Forest?
Yes, Poplar. Oh, remember those people peeking in his dining room? He wants privacy. So 60 miles away on another piece of property that he owns, he built another house, and that was Poplar Forest. And it was octagonal in shape. And again, it's a house built just for him. and he would take a few slaves, and he would load up those bookcases into the carts, and he would go out to Poplar Forest for months to get away. And so go to Poplar Forest. It's not as well known as Monticello. Let me just go, but it is beautiful. And it is one of a kind. Thank you so much for asking about that.
Also in Virginia.
Yes, near Lynchburg, very close to, so it's south. And so we're looking at the portico. It's octagonal in shape. Jefferson loved octagonals. He said that the extra sides of that, it provided, allowed more light to come in. So a little, pardon?
Our living room.
Oh, okay, so very Jeffersonian, yeah. Yes, sir.
What impact did he have on American architects of his time?
Not much.
I mean, he said how.
No, he did. I talked about how he wanted the capital to be. He wanted every American state to build a Roman temple as its new state capital. And what happened? The Massachusetts state capital, Bullfinch's beautiful state capital with the dome, which was going up not too long after that. That became the model. And he did not have a lot of influence. And then people forgot about architecture. And it wasn't until the 1920s that a historian discovered these drawings that he had done. And it was recognized that he had done all of this building. So in the 100 years after his death, he became known for many things, but none of them were building. So again, a disappointment, a man living, trying so hard to be a model, a mentor, and America, we don't have the money, we don't have the taste, we don't have the need for it in many ways. But that's Jefferson the optimist. That's who we could be. That's who America could be. Yes, sir?
Did Jefferson himself design the old campus at the University of Virginia, the lawns and the rotunda and all that?
Yes, Jefferson, it was the hobby of his old age. It wasn't playing golf or sitting on boards. It was building a university. And it was a university that was unlike any university in the world. And physically, it looked completely different. And Jefferson corresponded with educators around the world. What do young men need to know in order to become well-versed citizens, wise men in this world? And then he created a university and hired the faculty to teach. Now, here's the other side of the University of Virginia. Jefferson is doing this as tensions between the North and the South are getting very hot. And Jefferson knew that the South did not have much in the way of educational institutions. Princeton was the University of the South. So Madison and a lot of planters went to Princeton. But Jefferson was wary that young Southern boys go up north and they hear these stories about slavery, or they're challenged. And Jefferson wanted to create a school that was so good that Southern boys would stay home, and that even the very best of those young Northern boys would be attracted to the school because its curriculum was so progressive, so smart. It was unlike anything you could get anywhere. Unfortunately, the first students who showed up were mostly sons of planters, and they immediately started dueling, and things sort of fell apart for about 30 years at the university. So again, it's this optimistic project, but has this undercurrent of sort of fear in many ways. Jefferson dies a really sad, fearful man. Jefferson dies as Andrew Jackson is elected president. Wow. To Jefferson and the founders, Jackson was everything they had feared in a president. And so he thought Americans would be... Did I say something wrong? Okay. Well, we survived President Jackson. We can... No. No, so when he died, he was really fearful for what the country was becoming. He thought it would become refined as he had imagined it would, and people would accept these ideas, and we would all read and become educated and see the wisdom of that. And instead, we were going through the Second Great Awakening. We were going through the creation of evangelical religions in America. So we were becoming a very different America than Jefferson had imagined. He writes this sad letter to his friend, and the lines are something like, he's talking about their friends, all dead, and those who are alive know us not, and we don't know them. So by 26, it's like Jefferson, that didn't matter. That wasn't what America was thinking in the 26. And in fact, Jefferson, the state legislature of Virginia, made him list his accomplishments. He wanted the state to contribute to UVA. Well, tell us what you're doing and why we should do this. So why should we give you the money to do this? So, well, I wrote the Declaration of Independence. But that's, at the end of his life, he was, not of interest to the American people. And not until the end of the 19th century and the colonial revival and this nostalgia for the country that we almost destroyed in the Civil War. So, thank you.